A soaked German Shepherd puppy planted himself in front of a former Navy SEAL's truck and refused to let him pass. Jason was already late to a hospital meeting about his mother, but the puppy kept running toward an old house, then racing back to drag him along. What waited beyond that open door was not just a rescue, it was a secret tied to someone Jason loved. Before we begin, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable stories of courage, loyalty, and hope. Rain clung to Lebanon, Ohio, after the night storm, leaving the road black, the trees dripping, and torn clouds retreating across a pale morning sky. Jason Harper drove toward Warren County Medical Center with both hands steady on the wheel. At 39, the former Navy SEAL was tall and broad-shouldered, with a lean build, weathered fair skin, short dark brown hair, a square jaw, a trimmed beard, and blue-gray eyes that constantly checked mirrors and intersections. Years of service had trained him to notice exits, blind corners, and anything that did not belong. Those habits had once kept men alive, but in civilian life they often kept him distant. Jason now worked as a maritime security consultant, solving urgent problems in ports while postponing the quieter ones at home. His mother, Linda Harper, was 73, petite, with pale skin, silver blonde hair cut at her chin, and sharp green eyes. A former dental receptionist, she had managed nervous patients and disorganized doctors with brisk humor. Since her husband's death, independence had become proof that her life still belonged to her. 2 days earlier, she had fallen in her kitchen after a dizzy spell. Today's meeting would decide whether she could return home or needed assisted living. Jason had promised to arrive early. The clock read 8:18. His older sister, Megan, had made that promise necessary. At 42, Megan was of average height with warm brown skin, chestnut hair tied at her neck, and hazel eyes made tired by responsibility. Practical and loyal, she had spent months handling Linda's appointments and medications while Jason worked away from home. He feared the quiet way she looked at him whenever he arrived after the difficult part was over. He had missed their father's surgery because deployment orders changed and missed another crisis because work kept him away. Each absence had a reason. Together, they had become a pattern. This time, Jason told himself, he would be there before the decisions began. Movement burst from the wet grass. Jason braked before his mind finished identifying the shape. The pickup stopped several feet from a German Shepherd puppy standing in the center of the lane. The pup was barely 3 months old, with soaked black and tan fur, mud above his oversized paws, one triangular ear struggling upright, and the other folded sideways. His chest rose and fell too quickly. There was no collar around his neck and no person calling from the nearby houses. His amber eyes remained fixed on Jason. "Come on," Jason murmured, tapping the horn once. The pup, startled, hurried to the shoulder, then stepped into the road again as soon as the truck moved. He ran toward a row of older homes, reached 2 driveways, and looked back. When Jason stayed behind the wheel, the puppy returned. He repeated the journey more slowly, water flying from his paws. Jason's phone lit up. Megan's message appeared across the screen. "Mom is asking if you're really coming." The words struck harder because they contained no accusation. He imagined Linda sitting upright in a hospital chair, pretending the meeting did not matter, while listening for footsteps in the hallway. He imagined Megan holding the medical folder, prepared to speak for both of them. Jason could call animal control, move the puppy onto a lawn, and continue driving. Yet, the puppy did not behave like a lost animal. He always ran toward the same houses, always returned, and always checked whether Jason followed. The former SEAL in him recognized the pattern. This was not obstruction. It was communication. Jason rolled forward again. The puppy moved aside, then chased the truck. Jason stopped and opened the door. The pup rose on trembling hind legs, caught the loose fabric near Jason's ankle between tiny teeth, and pulled. His grip was gentle but determined. He lost his footing, nearly fell, then tried again. Up close, Jason could see that the puppy was not starving or badly injured. He was simply exhausted, as if he had made the same desperate trip for hours. Jason crouched. "What are you trying to show me?" The puppy released his trouser leg, turned toward the houses, and looked back. Jason glanced toward the hospital road. Duty pulled in both directions. If he followed, he might fail his family again. If he left, he might ignore the only warning someone was able to send. One obligation waited in a hospital room. The other stood before him on muddy paws, without a voice. Jason looked at his watch one final time, shut off the engine, and slipped the keys into his pocket. "All right," he said. "Show me." The puppy turned immediately and ran. Jason followed through the wet neighborhood. The two sets of paw prints crossed beneath the climbing roses and disappeared at the bottom of the porch steps. Jason studied them for only a moment before Tucker scratched at the pale blue front door, which stood open by several inches. The puppy pushed his nose into the gap, slipped inside, then returned almost immediately and pressed his damp body against Jason's shin. Jason climbed the porch and called into the house. "Hello? Is anyone home?" His voice traveled through the rooms without an answer. He knocked against the frame, announced that he was entering to check on the resident, and waited again. Tucker hurried inside. Jason followed, keeping one hand near his phone and the other free. The narrow entryway smelled of old wood, rain-damp fabric, and something sweet from the kitchen. A floral umbrella lay open on the floor as though someone had dropped it while coming through the door. Nothing appeared disturbed, yet the silence felt wrong. Tucker ran toward the kitchen, turned, and returned to Jason before racing away again. The kitchen revealed a morning interrupted rather than abandoned. A white ceramic teapot sat beside the stove, its contents cold. Flour covered part of the wooden counter, and a rolling pin rested across a flattened sheet of dough. A bowl of sliced strawberries and rhubarb had darkened slightly in the humid air. 6 small hand pies waited on a baking tray, their edges carefully folded but still pale and unbaked. A woman had planned to finish them. She had expected the morning to continue. Jason touched the side of the teapot and felt no warmth. A clock above the refrigerator ticked toward 8:40. Tucker paced between the kitchen and the hallway, whining each time Jason stopped. Before Jason could follow, a screen door slammed outside. An elderly man crossed the neighboring yard with one hand gripping a wooden cane. He was about 70, tall but bent slightly at the waist, with a narrow face, deeply lined fair skin, thin white hair, and a short gray mustache. He wore dark work trousers beneath a faded red robe, and his leather slippers were already soaked. His name was Frank Callahan. Decades as a postal carrier had made him observant, punctual, and familiar with every household on the street, but arthritis in his right knee had recently taught him the dangerous habit of postponing anything that required crossing wet ground. "You looking for Ruth?" he called. Jason stepped back onto the porch. "Does she live here?" Frank nodded toward the open door, and concern tightened his mouth. Ruth Whitmore, 76, retired home economics teacher. About 5'3", silver hair always pinned at the back, soft brown eyes, and more energy than people half her age. Kind to everyone, stubborn with herself. Ruth had been widowed 6 years earlier and had remained in the house alone. According to Frank, she baked for the library, repaired her own curtains, and accepted help only after arguing that she did not need it. "She opens those kitchen curtains before 7 every morning," he said, "even when she's sick." The curtains remained closed. Frank looked toward the untouched bird feeder near the window. He explained that the storm had awakened him during the night. He had heard dogs crying some time after the thunder grew worse, but assumed the puppies were frightened. His knee had been swollen, and rain had been blowing sideways across the yards. "I told myself I'd check after sunrise," he admitted. Shame lowered his voice. "Then I made coffee. Then I waited for the ground to dry." Jason did not criticize him. He understood how delay disguised itself as practicality. "How many puppies?" Frank looked toward Tucker. 2. Ruth adopted brothers from a rescue near Cincinnati about a month ago. That one's Tucker, brave enough to challenge a lawnmower. He scanned the porch and the wet yard. "Where's Finn?" At the sound of the second name, Tucker spun toward the hallway. A faint whine came from the rear of the house. It was so soft, Jason might have mistaken it for a floorboard if Tucker had not answered with a sharp bark. Jason moved down the hall. Framed photographs lined the wall. Ruth beside a broad-shouldered man with white hair, Ruth surrounded by teenage students holding aprons, and two German Shepherd puppies curled together inside a cardboard box. The smaller pup in the photograph had darker fur around his face and both ears folded forward. Tucker reached a narrow wooden door and scratched beneath the handle. Beside him lay Finn. The second German Shepherd puppy was also 3 months old, but smaller and more delicately built than his brother. His black and tan coat was soaked around the chest and forelegs, while his dark muzzle rested against the floor. Both ears remained soft and folded. His brown eyes were gentle, cautious, and exhausted. Several nails on his front paws had been scraped raw from clawing at the door. When Jason approached, Finn did not rise to greet him or retreat in fear. He lifted his head, touched his nose to the bottom panel, and scratched once more. Tucker stood beside him, breathing rapidly. One brother had left the house to find help. The other had remained at the last place he had heard Ruth. Jason crouched and examined Finn without forcing him to move. There was no heavy bleeding and no obvious broken limb, but the puppy's muscles trembled from fatigue. Cool air flowed from beneath the door, carrying the smell of damp concrete. Jason rose. "Frank, call 911. Tell them an elderly resident may be trapped inside the house. Ask for fire and medical." Frank pulled a phone from his robe and began speaking to the dispatcher. Jason announced himself again, this time toward the closed door. "Ruth, my name is Jason Harper. I'm here with your dogs." No voice answered. He slowly turned the handle. The door opened onto a steep basement staircase swallowed by gray darkness. Finn tried to push himself up, but his legs folded beneath him. Tucker placed his front paws on the first step and stared downward. Jason held both puppies back, leaned into the doorway, and listened. For several seconds there was only the sound of water dripping somewhere beneath the house. Then 3 weak taps rose from the darkness. The 3 taps faded into the damp darkness below, leaving Jason with the certainty that someone was alive and running out of strength. He kept one hand across Tucker's chest, preventing the puppy from rushing onto the steep stairs, then turned toward Frank. "Tell the dispatcher we have a response from the basement. Ask them to update fire and medical." Frank repeated the message, his voice trembling despite his effort to sound composed. Jason switched on the flashlight from his phone and tested the first wooden step with his boot. Moisture had darkened the edges, and the railing shifted slightly beneath his palm. "Ruth, I'm coming down," he called. A faint sound answered, too weak to form a full word. Jason descended carefully, placing his weight near the wall where the boards appeared strongest. Behind him, Tucker whined, while Finn remained on the hallway floor, his scraped paws stretched toward the opening. At the bottom of the staircase, a weak gray light entered through a narrow basement window. Metal shelves, boxes of holiday decorations, folded tables, and rows of glass jars emerged from the shadows. A shallow layer of storm water covered part of the concrete floor, reflecting Jason's flashlight in broken silver lines. Near the far wall, an old shelving unit had fallen forward. Ruth Whitmore lay behind its twisted frame, one shoulder pressed against the foundation and her right leg trapped beneath 2 crossbars. She was a small, slender woman with pale, lightly freckled skin, silver hair partly loose from the pins at the back of her head, and soft brown eyes dulled by exhaustion. Her flowered blouse was damp at one sleeve, and a narrow scrape marked her forearm. Despite nearly 15 hours on the concrete, her expression still held the quiet dignity of someone accustomed to comforting others before admitting her own pain. "Ruth?" Jason asked. Her eyelids lifted. "Here." He moved one step closer, then stopped. A damaged electrical cable hung from the foundation wall near the flooded section. Its black outer covering had split, exposing a thin glint of copper only a few feet above the water. The basement appeared still, but Jason knew stillness meant nothing around electricity. One careless step could turn a rescue into 2 casualties. "Don't move," he said. "There's water near a damaged wire. I need the power shut off before I reach you." Ruth's mouth moved into a tired half-smile. "I had no ambitious plans." Jason backed toward the stairs without turning away from her. "Frank, where's the main breaker?" "Laundry alcove beside the kitchen," Frank called. "Turn off the main, then tell dispatch about standing water and exposed wiring." Frank moved as quickly as his painful knee allowed. Seconds later, the dim basement bulb went dark, the radio upstairs fell silent, and the refrigerator's hum disappeared. Jason waited until Frank confirmed the main breaker was off, then studied the safest route with his flashlight. He stepped around the deepest water, testing each patch of concrete before transferring his weight. When he reached Ruth, he crouched beside the fallen shelf without touching it. Her right leg and hip were pinned, but there was no heavy bleeding or obvious deformity. Her lips were dry, and her breathing was shallow but regular. "Can you tell me your full name?" "Ruth Elaine Whitmore." "Do you know what day it is?" "Thursday, unless the basement has changed the calendar." The answer reassured him. Jason asked whether she could move her toes and where she felt the worst pain. Ruth managed each response after a pause. The accident had happened shortly after 6 the previous evening when she came downstairs to retrieve empty jars. The sump pump had already stopped during the storm. When she pulled a box from the lower shelf, the weakened frame tore away from the wall and collapsed. She had used a loose canning lid to tap against the pipe whenever she heard movement upstairs. "The puppies?" she whispered suddenly. "Are both of them safe?" Jason looked toward the staircase where Tucker's shadow shifted behind the doorway. "They're safe. Tucker found me on the road. Finn stayed at this door." Ruth closed her eyes, and relief softened her face more than any promise about her own condition could have. "Good boys." A workbench stood several feet away. Beneath it, Jason found a compact hydraulic jack, thick wooden blocks, and 2 solid planks. He inspected the wood for rot before sliding one plank beneath a strong section of the shelving frame. Using the jack, he raised the metal only enough to reduce the downward pressure. The shelf creaked, and he stopped immediately, checking every contact point. When the structure steadied, he wedged the wooden blocks underneath and slowly lowered the frame onto them. He did not attempt to pull Ruth free. The weight had shifted, but moving her without medical equipment could worsen an unseen injury. Instead, he sat where she could see him and kept one hand close to the support. "The fire department is almost here. Stay awake and tell me about the pies upstairs." "Strawberry rhubarb," Ruth murmured. "They were supposed to be baked before 9. "Then we still have an emergency." A small breath of laughter escaped her. Sirens grew louder outside. Ruth glanced toward the stairs. "May I see them?" Jason considered the dry route along the wall. The power was off, and the puppies could remain safely on the lowest dry step. He called Tucker first. The bolder pup descended with his body low, pausing whenever the wood creaked. Jason then climbed halfway and lifted Finn, whose exhausted legs could no longer manage the stairs. He carried the smaller puppy down and placed him beside Tucker on the last dry step. Both puppies stared at Ruth. When Jason guided them close enough, Tucker pressed his nose beneath her hand. Finn lay beside his brother, his scraped paws tucked under his chest. Ruth lifted 2 fingers and touched the fur between their ears. Only then did both puppies finally lie still. Heavy boots sounded overhead. The rescue team was led by Captain Daniel Brooks, a 46-year-old firefighter with a powerful build, dark skin, a shaved head, and calm, deep-set eyes. 15 years of responding to rural accidents had taught him to speak gently while moving with absolute precision. Beside him came paramedic Claire Morgan, a 34-year-old woman with an athletic frame, light brown skin, curly black hair secured beneath a navy cap, and a focused but reassuring manner shaped by years of treating frightened elderly patients. Jason quickly explained the wiring, the water, Ruth's condition, and the temporary supports. Daniel inspected the stabilization, replaced it with professional lifting equipment, and directed the crew through a controlled extraction. Claire monitored Ruth's circulation and breathing while the shelf was raised. Once Ruth was free, they secured her on a padded stretcher and covered her with a blanket. Tucker followed the stretcher through the house, while Jason carried Finn against his chest. Outside, the storm clouds had begun to separate, and pale sunlight touched the wet porch. Frank stood beside the ambulance, gripping his cane with both hands, guilt and relief competing across his lined face. As the paramedics prepared to close the doors, Ruth turned toward Jason. "There's a brown paper bag in the kitchen," she said. "It has Linda Harper's name on it." Jason froze. "Linda Harper is my mother." Recognition entered Ruth's tired eyes. "Then take it to her," she whispered. "Tell her I'm still saving her chair." By the time Jason reached Warren County Medical Center, the storm had thinned into a gray mist that clung to the parking lot and silvered the windows. He entered the recovery wing nearly 40 minutes late, carrying the brown paper bag against his side. Mud had dried in dark streaks along his trousers, rust dust marked his right sleeve, and several strands of black and tan puppy fur clung to the front of his shirt. The hospital's bright lights made every stain impossible to hide. Megan stood outside Linda's room with a blue folder pressed against her chest. She had retied her chestnut hair into a neat knot, but loose strands framed her tired face, and the shadows beneath her hazel eyes revealed another morning spent managing forms, doctors, and their mother's fear without help. Her gaze moved from Jason's clothing to the wall clock and then to the paper bag in his hand. She did not ask what had happened. That restraint struck harder than anger. "You always have a reason," she said quietly. "Most of them are good ones." Jason felt the familiar defense rising inside him. The puppy in the road, the open house, the flooded basement, the damaged wire, the shelf pressing against Ruth's body. Every detail was true. Every detail could explain why he had been late. Yet, Megan's expression reminded him that one heroic morning could not erase all the ordinary mornings when she had been the one who stayed. She had sat beside their father after surgery, repaired storm damage at the farmhouse, found Linda's lost prescriptions, and answered calls Jason had promised to return. His absences had rarely come from indifference. That was what made them so easy to forgive in himself. "I'm sorry," he said. No explanation followed. Megan studied him as if waiting for the rest, then slowly opened the door. Linda sat upright in a wheelchair near the window, wearing a pale green cardigan over a white blouse. Her silver blonde hair had been brushed carefully around her narrow face, and faint purple bruising showed near one wrist where she had caught herself during the fall. Even seated, she carried herself with the crisp authority of the dental receptionist who had once managed nervous patients, confused insurance companies, and 3 dentists who regularly misplaced their own schedules. Her sharp green eyes moved between the people in the room, alert and irritated by the way concern had gathered around her like a fence. Beside the bed stood Dr. Thomas Reed, a 52-year-old physician with a lean frame, medium brown skin, close-cropped salt-and-pepper hair, rectangular glasses, and a calm voice that had been shaped by years of speaking with proud patients who heard medical advice as a threat to their independence. He was patient without being patronizing, though Linda clearly suspected every gentle sentence of hiding a decision already made. "Temporary assisted living would allow us to monitor the dizziness while physical therapy improves your balance," he explained. Linda tapped one finger against the clipboard resting on her lap. "You keep saying temporary as though the room becomes mine if you repeat the word enough." Dr. Reed did not flinch. "The goal is to lower the risk of another fall." Megan mentioned the loose kitchen rug, the narrow hallway, and the basement steps Linda still used whenever she wanted canned peaches. "I am sitting right here," Linda said, her voice controlled but sharp. The room fell quiet. Jason understood what she was fighting. To Megan and the doctor, they were discussing safety. To Linda, they were measuring how much of her life could be removed before she stopped recognizing it. He placed the paper bag on the table and pulled a chair beside her, rather than standing with the others. "I should have been here," he said. Linda looked directly at him. "Yes." The single word held disappointment, but not cruelty. Jason accepted it. For years, he had believed that admitting fault required surrendering the reasons behind it. Now he understood that both things could be true. He had saved Ruth, and he had still left his sister alone at the meeting. He rested his hands on his knees. "Do you know Ruth Whitmore?" Linda's expression changed before she answered. The anger did not disappear, but something more vulnerable moved beneath it. "Why are you asking about Ruth?" Jason told them what had happened, beginning with Tucker standing in the road and ending with the ambulance doors closing. He described Finn waiting at the basement door, the fallen shelf, the water, and Ruth asking whether both puppies were safe before asking about herself. He kept the account simple, avoiding any attempt to make himself sound heroic. When he finished, Linda's fingers had tightened around the edge of the clipboard. "How badly is she hurt?" "She was conscious." The paramedics said they believed her injuries were stable, but they were bringing her here for tests. Jason lifted the brown paper bag. The top had softened from the damp air, but the writing remained clear. He placed it on Linda's lap. In careful blue ink, Ruth had written, "For Linda Harper, save her chair by the window." Linda stared at the words for a long time. Megan moved closer. "What chair?" she asked. Linda ran one thumb across Ruth's handwriting. When she spoke, her voice had lost its defensive edge. She explained that she and Ruth had met years earlier at a recipe exchange in the public library. Every Thursday, a small group gathered near the tall windows to share coffee, handwritten recipes, and stories about the people who had taught them to cook. Ruth always sat near the pastry table. Linda claimed the chair beside the window because the light was better there, though everyone knew she also liked watching people arrive. After her balance worsened and she began using a cane, Linda stopped attending. "I didn't want them watching me cross the room," she admitted. "I didn't want anyone rushing to move chairs or carrying my cup as though I had become made of glass." Megan asked whether Ruth knew why she had stopped. Linda looked toward the window. "She knew I was staying home." Ruth had continued reserving the chair each Thursday. She sent recipe cards through mutual friends, left a jar of peach preserves with the librarian, and wrote Linda's name on packages of food she hoped would tempt her back. The unfinished hand pies had not been a casual gift. Ruth had been preparing another invitation. Jason looked at his mother, then at the bag resting against her cardigan. The woman he had followed Tucker to save had spent weeks trying to reach Linda in a quieter way. Ruth had been trapped beneath a shelf, but before the accident, she had already recognized another kind of danger. A proud friend slowly disappearing from the places where people expected her. Jason felt the meaning settle heavily inside him. He had thought the morning forced him to choose between helping a stranger and keeping a promise to his mother. Instead, the road had led him to someone who had been keeping a place for Linda when he had not. By late afternoon, sunlight had broken through the clouds above Warren County Medical Center, warming the rain-darkened paths of the rehabilitation garden behind the hospital. Ruth sat beneath a covered patio with a light gray blanket across her knees, her silver hair newly pinned but still untidy near one temple. A soft brace supported her right leg, and the exhaustion of 15 hours beneath the fallen shelf remained visible in the pale hollows beneath her brown eyes. Even so, she watched the garden with quiet alertness, as if being injured had inconvenienced her rather than frightened her. Linda arrived in a wheelchair pushed by Jason, with Megan walking beside them carrying her cane. Linda's pale green cardigan had been buttoned carefully, and her silver blonde hair framed her narrow face in the orderly style she preferred. Her posture remained stiff, partly from soreness and partly from the determination not to appear diminished in front of Ruth. Jason could feel the tension in her shoulders through the handles of the wheelchair. His mother had agreed to the meeting, but agreement was not the same as surrender. Frank waited near the garden gate with Tucker and Finn on borrowed red leashes. The elderly man had exchanged his wet robe for brown trousers, a plaid shirt, and a navy jacket that hung loosely from his tall, slightly bent frame. His thin, white hair had been combed, though his gray mustache still held the uneven shape of a hurried morning. Guilt had made him unusually quiet. Tucker spotted Ruth first. The larger puppy pulled hard enough to surprise Frank, bounded across the brick path and attempted to place both front paws on Ruth's chair. His oversized feet slipped against the metal footrest, sending him sideways into the wheel. For one solemn second, Tucker sat beside the chair as if the awkward arrival had been carefully planned. Linda laughed. The sound came freely and unexpectedly, carrying across the damp garden and startling even her. Jason had not heard her laugh that way since before the fall. Ruth looked at Tucker's innocent expression and shook her head. "You have caused enough trouble for one day." Tucker placed one paw on her shoe. Finn approached more slowly. The smaller puppy's black and tan coat had been cleaned, though his scraped front paws were lightly bandaged. Both soft ears still folded forward, giving his cautious face a permanently worried expression. He stopped within reach, looked at Ruth for permission, then rested one paw on the toe of her hospital slipper. Only after she lowered her hand did he lean his dark muzzle against her knee. Ruth's fingers moved gently between his ears. Her face softened, and the brave composure she had maintained since the rescue briefly gave way to relief. Jason watched both women. Ruth had nearly died alone beneath her own house. Linda had fallen alone in her kitchen. Yet neither seemed willing to name fear directly. Instead, they discussed dogs, weather, and whether hospitality had been designed to punish the sick. Frank stood behind the puppies, tightening his grip on the cane. "I should have crossed the yard last night," he said. "I heard them crying." Ruth looked at him. Frank's lined face tightened as he prepared himself for blame. "You also told me that Shelf needed new anchors," she replied, "more than once. I should have insisted, and I should have let you fix it." Ruth adjusted the blanket over her knees. "I knew it was loose. I decided knowing about a problem was close enough to solving it." Linda's mouth twitched. "That sounds familiar." Ruth turned toward her. "Does it?" Linda looked down at the cane Megan had placed beside her chair. For months, she had hidden brief waves of dizziness by gripping counters, walls, or the backs of chairs until the room steadied. She had told herself the episodes were minor because they ended quickly. Admitting them would have invited questions, medical appointments, and conversations about whether she was still safe alone. "I may have ignored a few dizzy spells," she said. Megan inhaled sharply but did not interrupt. Linda continued before courage could leave her. "I knew what everyone would say. First the loose rug, then the basement stairs, then someone would want my keys. Eventually I would be visiting my own house while strangers decided when I could make coffee." Jason heard the fear beneath her irritation. Linda did not believe Megan or Jason wished to punish her. She feared becoming a responsibility discussed in hallways, a schedule written on a refrigerator, a body kept safe after the life inside it had been reduced to inconvenience. Ruth glanced at her own brace. "I thought accepting help would make me look helpless," she said. "Instead, I spent 15 hours beneath a shelf because I wanted to move one box without asking Frank." The two women looked at each other. Their circumstances differed, but their pride spoke the same language. Neither feared age as much as being treated like someone whose choices no longer mattered. Jason moved around Linda's chair and crouched where she could see him without looking upward. "No one has to decide everything today," he said. "You don't have to move into assisted living now. Megan and I can make the farmhouse safer. We remove the loose rug, add a railing, install grab bars, and put an emergency alert button where you'll actually wear it." Linda narrowed her eyes. "You make that sound simple." "It isn't. We also set regular check-ins, and you tell us when the dizziness happens instead of pretending the kitchen moved." Megan folded her arms, but a tired smile appeared. "I can call every morning. Jason can take evenings when he's traveling." Jason felt the weight of that promise. In the past, he had offered help in broad, impressive statements. This time, he understood that trust would be rebuilt through small calls made repeatedly. Linda looked toward the wet flower beds. "And if my balance gets worse?" "Then we review it together," Jason answered. "Together means you are in the room. No decisions behind your back." Ruth rested both hands on the blanket. "A house can still belong to you after someone else gets a key." Linda studied her. "That depends on who gets it." "Then choose carefully." Wind moved through the garden, shaking droplets from the leaves. Tucker settled beside Ruth's chair, while Finn lay across Linda's shoe as though joining the negotiation. Linda looked at Megan, then at Jason. Her expression remained guarded, but the fear behind it had loosened. "I will try it," she said, "but I choose who keeps the spare key." Clear mornings returned to Lebanon after the storm, though brief afternoon showers still passed over the town and left the streets shining beneath the sun. Jason postponed his flight to Virginia and extended his stay in Ohio by 1 week. His contract manager rearranged 2 meetings, an inconvenience that would once have filled him with restless guilt. This time, Jason accepted it without searching for an excuse to leave early. Linda returned to the farmhouse with strict instructions to rest, report every dizzy spell, and avoid the basement stairs. She inspected the house as if expecting her children to replace it with a hospital room while she was away. Instead, Jason and Megan began with the loose kitchen rug. Megan rolled it toward the back door while Jason cleared a wider path between the bedroom, bathroom, and kitchen. They installed grab bars beside the shower and near the rear steps, added brighter bulbs to the hallway, and placed an emergency alert device beside Linda's wristwatch each morning. Linda examined every change with her sharp green eyes. "The bathroom bar is crooked," she announced. Jason placed a level against it. The bubble rested exactly in the center. "It's straight." Linda folded her arms over her pale blue blouse. "It leans toward the window." Megan, standing in the doorway with her chestnut hair tied loosely behind her neck, smiled for the first time that morning. "He used to work with military navigation equipment, Mom." "Then he should be able to recognize a crooked bar." Jason loosened one side, adjusted it by a fraction too small to matter, and tightened it again. Linda inspected the result. "Better." The corner of her mouth lifted before she turned away. The argument returned something familiar to the farmhouse. For several days, every conversation had sounded like a medical evaluation. Now the kitchen once again held teasing, coffee, and the ordinary friction of people who knew one another too well to remain polite for long. Across town, Ruth had also returned home. Her right leg remained supported by a brace, and she moved slowly with a borrowed cane. But she refused to let the accident transform her living room into a place of whispered voices. Jason removed the damaged basement shelving and replaced it with a heavy wooden system anchored directly into the wall studs. He moved full boxes and glass jars to waist height, installed a brighter light above the stairs, and placed a battery lantern near the basement door. Frank repaired the softened porch board, tightened the railing, and realigned the rain gutter that had twisted during the storm. His arthritic knee forced him to rest often, but each morning he returned with a different tool and the day's mail tucked beneath one arm. Before Ruth's accident, Frank had watched her curtains from across the yard and believed observation was the same as care. Now he carried the mail to her door and waited until he heard her answer. Tucker followed every worker as though supervising the repairs. The 3-month-old German Shepherd charged after screwdrivers, inspected open toolboxes, and once attempted to carry away a work glove nearly as large as his head. His oversized paws still moved faster than the rest of his body, causing him to slide around corners with very little dignity. Finn remained closer to Ruth. Smaller and quieter than his brother, he usually lay beside her chair with his bandaged paws tucked beneath his chest, lifting his dark muzzle whenever she moved. Yet the 2 puppies never stayed apart for long. If Tucker disappeared into the hallway, Finn's folded ears rose as much as they could until his brother returned. If Finn fell asleep too deeply beside Ruth, Tucker eventually came back and dropped down against him, pretending the reunion had not concerned him. By the middle of the week, Ruth and Linda resumed planning the library gathering they had nearly canceled. The event was called Recipes We Remember, and it had been Ruth's idea months before the accident. The public library's program coordinator, Alice Monroe, visited Ruth's kitchen with a stack of registration sheets. Alice was a 58-year-old woman of average height, with warm brown skin, short, silver-streaked curls, amber-framed glasses, and a calm, welcoming manner. After 26 years working in the library, she had watched attendance decline as families moved away and community meetings shifted to larger buildings near the highway. She loved the library fiercely, but never begged people to value it. She preferred to give them a reason to return. Rather than letting the gathering become a public retelling of Ruth's rescue, Alice suggested inviting residents to bring a recipe connected to someone they loved, missed, or wished younger generations could remember. Linda approved immediately. "People will come for the food," she said, arranging blank recipe cards into a perfect stack. "They'll stay because everyone wants to tell you their mother cooked something better than yours." Ruth sat at the table wearing a cream blouse, her silver hair pinned neatly again, while Megan measured strawberries and rhubarb beside her. Jason handled the oven trays because neither older woman was permitted to carry anything heavy. Frank brought 2 baskets of strawberries from a roadside farm stand and stayed to repair a cabinet hinge that had irritated Ruth for years. The kitchen gradually filled with the scent of warm pastry, fruit, coffee, and voices no longer lowering themselves whenever someone mentioned a cane. Tucker slept beneath the table until a piece of baked crust fell near Linda's shoe. He woke instantly, seized it, and carried it behind an armchair. There, he sat with his back straight and the stolen crust held between his paws, his serious amber eyes suggesting that he was conducting official business. Finn followed him, but did not participate in the crime. He sat beside the chair, looked from Tucker to Ruth, and released a soft, uncertain whine, as if considering whether loyalty to his brother required silence. Linda laughed so hard that Megan moved the fruit bowl away from the edge of the table. Ruth called Tucker a thief, though she made no attempt to recover the crust before he finished it. Jason stood in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel over one shoulder and watched his mother write names across the recipe cards. Her cane rested beside her chair, and the alert button remained fastened around her wrist, but neither object commanded the room. Linda's voice carried easily as she corrected Ruth's spelling, teased Frank about the crooked cabinet, and reminded Alice to reserve the chair beside the library window. Jason finally understood that safety was not only a clear hallway, a stronger railing, or a button close enough to press. His mother also needed work that still required her hands, friends who noticed when she disappeared, and a place where someone genuinely expected her to arrive. A soft June rain darkened the sidewalks around Lebanon Public Library, tapping against the tall windows while pale sunlight waited behind thinning clouds. Inside, Jason and Frank arranged wooden chairs in a wide circle around the reading room. Ruth sat near the food table with her cane resting against one knee and Finn curled beside her shoe. Her silver hair was pinned neatly, and the cream blouse beneath her blue cardigan gave her back some of the quiet elegance she had carried before the accident. Yet, Jason noticed how often her brown eyes moved toward the entrance. 30 strawberry rhubarb hand pies stood beneath glass covers, and 60 blank recipe cards had been placed beside the registration book. At 11:55, only 4 visitors had arrived. The empty chairs seemed larger each time Ruth looked at them. She had feared people would remember her only as the elderly woman found beneath a fallen shelf. Now another fear appeared. Perhaps the town had already begun forgetting the library itself. Linda sat in her familiar chair beside the window, wearing a soft green blouse and her silver blonde hair carefully shaped around her narrow face. Her cane remained within reach, and the emergency alert button rested beside her wristwatch. Neither object embarrassed her now. She wrote the names of arriving guests in her precise handwriting, aligning each card before beginning the next. "People are waiting for the rain to stop," Ruth said. Linda looked toward the gray street. "Then they will arrive with cleaner shoes." The front door opened before Ruth could answer. An elderly man named Walter Bennett entered, carrying a folded piece of notebook paper inside a plastic bag. Walter was 78, short and squarely built, with ruddy skin, thick white eyebrows, a clean-shaven jaw, and broad hands permanently darkened by decades of engine grease. He had worked as an auto mechanic until arthritis forced him to retire, and since his wife's death 2 years earlier, he had spoken less because every ordinary story still seemed to end with her name. The paper contained her corn soup recipe, the meal she had cooked whenever one of their children came home sick. Walter had never made it himself, but he remembered every can, spoon, and saucepan she placed on the counter. Ruth invited him to sit. A few minutes later, Eleanor Price arrived holding an index card yellowed with age. She was 81, tall and narrow, with warm brown skin, silver braids wrapped around her head, and dark eyes bright with gentle humor. A flour stain covered one corner of the card, and half the word cinnamon had faded beneath a mark left in 1978. When Linda offered to copy the recipe onto a clean card, Eleanor shook her head. "That stain has been in my family longer than some of my relatives. It stays." More people followed. Some had heard about Tucker running into the road and Finn refusing to leave the basement door. They entered expecting to see the two puppies who had helped save Ruth. Tucker greeted every visitor with reckless enthusiasm, leaning into hands and placing muddy paws on shoes despite Jason's attempts to teach him manners. After 15 minutes of attention, the larger puppy became overwhelmed by voices, laughter, and fingers reaching for his uneven ears. He crawled beneath the nearest table and pressed himself against Jason's boot. Finn remained beside Ruth, his smaller black and tan body resting quietly between her chair and the wall. His bandages had been removed, though the fur around his front paws was still shorter where the nails had scraped. He watched the room without seeking attention, raising his dark muzzle whenever Ruth shifted. People came because of the puppies, but they stayed for the recipes. Walter spoke about his wife stretching corn soup through hard winters by adding potatoes. Eleanor remembered her mother measuring flour with a coffee cup because the family owned no proper measuring set. A retired teacher brought a cake recipe written on the back of an electric bill. A young mother carried a stained card from a grandmother her children had never met. The reading room filled slowly and then almost at once. Jason and Frank carried additional chairs from the children's section. Megan opened another page in the registration book, while Alice Monroe moved between tables, listening more than she spoke. Ruth stopped watching the entrance. She began moving carefully from one group to another, asking where each recipe came from and refusing to let anyone shorten a story merely because it was painful. No one treated her like an exhibit of misfortune. She had work to do. By mid-afternoon, all 30 hand pies had been divided into halves so everyone could taste one. 7 visitors volunteered for future library shifts, 12 requested another recipe gathering in July, and 2 retired teachers offered to lead a Saturday reading hour. Alice stood near the circulation desk with tears shining behind her amber-framed glasses. The commitments were modest, but they were enough for the library board to maintain its weekend schedule through the summer. Ruth had worried the accident would reduce her life to one night beneath a shelf. Instead, the town remembered the table she had set, the chair she had kept, and the invitation she had refused to stop extending. Near the window, Linda helped Walter rewrite his wife's recipe, pausing whenever he needed time to remember whether the cream was added before or after the corn. Her usual chair was no longer empty. Her cane stood beside it, but 3 people waited for her handwriting, and 2 more had asked whether she would help organize the next gathering. Jason watched from the back of the room and understood that his mother had not returned merely because the house was safer. She had returned because someone had continued expecting her. When the last visitors began to leave, the rain had stopped and sunlight warmed the library steps. Frank carried empty baskets to Ruth's car, promising to bring her mail the following morning. Megan gathered unused name tags while Alice locked the recipe cards inside a cabinet for the next event. Ruth stood near the doorway with Finn at her side, laughing as Tucker attempted to pull a discarded paper plate from a trash bin. Jason began stacking chairs. Tucker eventually surrendered to exhaustion and fell asleep beneath a table with one paw resting across Jason's shoe. Finn curled beside Linda, his chin on the toe of her sensible black loafer. The 2 puppies no longer needed to choose between searching for help and remaining behind. There were enough people in the room to keep watch now. Linda approached Jason with her purse over one shoulder and her cane in one hand. "Are you staying for dinner?" His flight left early the next morning. The rental truck had to be returned, his bag remained unpacked, and several messages from Virginia waited unanswered on his phone. For years, a schedule like that would have ended the conversation before anyone asked the question. Jason looked at the watch that had measured his distance from every promise. He removed it and placed it beside the remaining recipe cards. "What are we having?" Linda smiled. "Leftovers." Jason lifted another chair and added it to the stack. Ruth would return to a safer home. Linda would remain independent with her family's support. Frank would no longer mistake watching for showing up, and the library would stay open because the town had remembered why it mattered. Tucker and Finn slept peacefully beneath the table, surrounded by people who had finally learned to notice the empty chair before it stayed empty too long. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or light. Sometimes God sends them quietly, through two puppies, an open door, a neighbor who crosses the yard, or a son who chooses to stay. This story reminds us that love appears in small acts of attention. Someone near us may be waiting for a call, a visit, a meal, or a sign that they have not been forgotten. Faith is not only believing that God is watching, it is becoming the hands, feet, and heart He can use in moments every single day. So look around, notice the empty chair, and listen for the cry others may be too proud or tired to make. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment and subscribe for more stories of loyalty and grace. May God bless you, protect your family, and fill your home with kindness.